Hi, welcome to the class. Today I am here with Theodora Ogden. She is a fellow with the Interplanetary Initiative, and her research currently focuses on emerging spacefaring nations. And welcome to the class. What got you interested in this field of research?
So originally I come from a security and defence world. So I work with RAND Europe, which is the sort of smaller part of the RAND corporation, where I do defence and security analysts. And more and more we've been working on space-related issues, so emerging technologies, emerging geopolitical threats, some of the risks that are involved in operating in the space domain. And it was also really important for me, coming from a legal background, to understand more about some of the international legal frameworks around equitable access to space and ensuring that emerging countries also have a role to play and a place in space, which is ultimately meant to be a sort of inclusive domain. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm researching equitable access to space for 6 months at the II at ASU.
Cool. So maybe for the rest of us here who don't quite understand the geopolitical, landscape of space agencies across the world, could you give us maybe a brief overview of who's out there and what they're focusing on?
Yeah, sure. So you have, of course, the sort of three main players, which are the US, China, and Russia. And relations between the three countries haven't always been great. And then if you kind of think about that, we're throwing a whole new range of actors into the mix. So you have a lot of emerging countries, so developing countries as well are starting to have a presence in space, but also a large number of private actors. And so the space domain is becoming increasingly congested and competitive. And you have more and more actors sort of wanting to make a mark for themselves in space. And there's a limited number of orbital slots. And the current system is very much first come, first served. So you do end up with quite a few actors that are sort of being left behind in that domain.
Okay, so is that why a country wants to develop space capacities? Like, I just want to claim my piece of the my geostationary orbit.
Well, yes, to some degree, if you want it, you got to get up there fast, right? But on the other hand, I mean, there's a lot of economic sense in having a space presence. I mean, the space market now is currently valued at over $300 billion, and that's expected to go up to about $1.5 trillion in the next 20 years. So it's a massive, massive market that it just sort of makes economic sense to participate in that. And it's also a major, major driver of development. I mean, if you develop a space program and you set up a space agency, you're essentially signaling to the world that you want to take your R&D forward, that you're investing in science and technology, that you're making a step towards becoming a major player economically as well as scientifically in the space domain.
Okay, so let's say I've got a small country. Wouldn't that be cool? And I don't have a presence in space, but now I want one. What are the steps that I go through? What capacities do I need? What technologies do I need to develop? How do I get started?
Right, well, I think a lot of countries sort of look at the major space powers and see, well, launch capability seems to be the sort of criteria that inducts you into the Space Hall of Fame and makes you sort of a major space player, right? However, launch is changing, right? Because payloads are becoming smaller and smaller, and so you don't need to have launch vehicles that are, as large as they currently are. So there is some potential for that. But on the other hand, I think a lot of countries might start to look elsewhere in niches, because that's sort of the area in which there really is a lot of potential. And take, for example, Brazil. I mean, they established their launch center in the 80s, but it was massively, underfunded and mismanaged. And in 2003, there was a huge explosion on the launch site that killed 21 scientists. And that's just, and so nowadays most of their launches take place from China or from India. So there's not much point investing in launch capabilities if you don't have the funding stream to go into it, right? But on the other hand, there are a lot of sort of problems that need to be solved in space. So orbital debris is a huge, huge problem. Another one is looking at environmental monitoring. And those are two areas out of many that developing and emerging space countries might want to focus in, because there's just so much scope to sort of make a name for yourself in those niches.
Is that the goal? Like, I just want to make no one's focusing on my little country, and I want a reputation, kind of like a I don't know, middle school sort of competition amongst kids on the sports field. Like, what is that the benefit that I hope to gain is street cred?
I think it goes beyond street cred. So again, I think it's if you look at the economic incentives, it's a huge market that if you can tap into that, you can do a lot in terms of development for your country. So I think that the economy is a huge driver of it. Also you have to upskill your workforce, right, to have a sustainable space program or a space sector. So again, it's a huge sort of step up in ensuring that your workforce is more trained, that has a better knowledge of STEM type subjects, and also it's a good move away from a resource-based economy towards one that is more knowledge-based, right? So moving away from, for example, in the UAE or Saudi Arabia, where they're starting to move away from oil exports and wanting to transition their economy towards one that is more varied. Okay.
So the idea is, you train your workforce. Maybe there's some trickle-down technologies like Velcro. That's super important to all of us.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of wondering, Elon Musk, I think he's famous for saying, the secret to earning $1 million in the space industry is to spend $10 million. Is that still true, or is space maybe more profitable than it used to be?
I think there's always going to be, and I think with Elon Musk in particular, he's someone who can afford to fail, right? And failure is a huge part of developing some of these, incredibly cutting edge technologies. And it's almost unavoidable in space, right? But on the other hand, I think that if you think sort of outside of the box in terms of, you don't need to throw hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars at the problem, right? So for example, with open source software, that is a huge resource that's available for developing countries and emerging space economies to use, right? Or modular systems, where if you think about CubeSats, that's had a massive impact on, for example, on the African continent, where you can build a satellite to do specifically what you need it to do at the sort of the lowest price possible and, in the smallest possible payload. Again, sort of, renewable aspects, so renewable launch vehicles is a huge turning point as well. So there's lots of sort of ways in which you can sort of get away with not having to throw loads and loads of money at the problem, right?
Well, okay, but so as you were saying, there's three major space powers, and I would imagine that for example, some of these African countries that are just getting started, you have to rely on a lot of partnerships to get your little CubeSat up. What's the benefit for the United States or Russia or China to partner with these emerging spacefaring countries and essentially offer them rides and possibly give away some of their, knowledge, and make space more competitive?
Sure, but at the same time, you need to think about some of the advantages and insights that these countries bring to the table, right? So, for example, taking the example of South Africa, I mean, they're a huge contributor to remote sensing or to Earth observation, and not just in terms of space-based systems, but also, some of their radars on Earth, the ground stations, are incredibly invaluable, and have played a huge role in a lot of NASA programs. So there is a lot that they can bring to the table, both in terms of their expertise, also in terms of unique launch geography, right? So you have, if you have a country that offers a unique entry into orbit, I mean, that's incredible. On the other hand, unique niche capabilities or niche expertise. For example, the UAE is an incredibly small player in terms of, in the global economy. However, in space, it's the leader in the Middle East for specifically for building satellites and putting them together. And it doesn't matter whether or not they're launching them, but still they build some of the world's best satellites. Or, for example, Luxembourg, which is a tiny, tiny country, and yet they have one of the largest satellite communication companies in the world. So there's a lot of expertise and a lot of capabilities that it's easy to kind of oversee and sort of think, well, hang on, we have it all in the US or in China or in Russia. But the reality is that, as well as bringing in these new niches and expertises, you're also bringing in new perspectives and looking at new ways to tackle problems that have existed for a while and will continue to exist and become increasingly problematic in the future.
Okay, so there's a place for everybody. Okay, so this class right here is maybe they're not necessarily politicians or decision makers. These are future, we can call them technologists, people who are actually making things. So how does this sort of like global context and geopolitical conflict, competition, partnership, how does this perhaps go back and affect, the work of these future students, these aspiring creators of technologies?
Well, I mean, I think that the geopolitical or the sort of security aspects of space has a huge knock-on effect. I mean, for example, now with the ongoing crisis in the Ukraine, Russia's most likely withdrawing from the International Space Station, which is, a huge blow to the international spacefaring community. And I think also in terms of, we've seen with, during COVID, it's been, global supply chains have been disrupted in a way that, has kind of shown us what can happen if there is conflict on Earth or if there is, if there are significant changes, right? And so all of these aspects can really have an impact on, the technicians as well as the politicians and the sort of, international lawyers or whatever. And so I think that more than ever, there's a need to kind of look at, own, collaborate, access, right? So what are some of the technologies that we need to own? And by own, I mean, your country has that sovereign capability. And, some countries will prioritize launch, like the US, and others might look at, more sort of remote sensing capabilities or something. And then collaborate. So what are some of the technologies that we really need the input from partners on? And we want to share the risks and we want to share the costs, but we also want to own a part of it, right? And then you need to look at sort of some of the technologies that we can risk only accessing. So, for example, in the UK, we might access some of the US space-based capabilities because it doesn't make economic sense necessarily for us to go out and invest in our own or duplicate efforts, right? And again, that's something that will always be at the forefront of your mind if you're working in sort of space-based systems. Is the technology that I'm working on now, is this something that we really need to own? Or can we collaborate? Can we access it? And what does it mean if we give up a part of that ownership, right? And I think especially with the sort of ongoing geopolitical climate, you need to sort of balance that quite carefully. And then also think about ways in which you can fold in the perspectives and the views of emerging spacefaring countries as well, since they do offer quite a sort of an important perspective and niche expertise that is, certainly useful.
Cool. Well, I think we're kind of running into our time. I think this is super interesting. I had no idea that Luxembourg was going to take over space. Theodora, thank you so much for joining our class. And thank you guys so much for listening in, and I will see you guys in the next video.
Bye.